The fluorescent lights at Sacred Heart Hospital hum their endless mechanical song, a sound Katie Rodriguez has learned to filter out like white noise. 11:45 p.m. The night shift stretches ahead of her like a familiar road, predictable and safe. She prefers it this way, the quiet hours when the hospital belongs to the skeleton's crew, when nobody asks questions about her past or wonders why she flinches at the sound of rotor blades. The ICU on the 7th floor is her kingdom of anonymity, a place where a competent nurse who keeps her head down can disappear into the work itself. She moves through the double doors wearing scrubs the color of faded denim, her dark hair pulled back so tightly her temples ache, her badge clipped to her collar where it catches the fluorescent glare and throws it back like a tiny mirror. Her name reads, Kade Rodriguez, RN. Just the initial, just the maiden name. Senior Chief Petty Officer is buried somewhere else, in a showbox at the back of a closet in the garage, pressed between a discharge paperwork she hasn't reread in 4 years and a box of photographs she hasn't looked at since Kandahar. The boots are in her locker downstairs. Worn desert tan leather, the laces knotted permanently because she still hasn't brought herself to untie them properly. Some small part of her can't quite let go. The ICU is quiet at this hour. Machines breathe for the unconscious. Monitors pulse with the steady drumbeat of still-beating hearts. Katie moves between the 4 isolation rooms with the fluid precision of someone who has done this 1,000 times before, checking for sites, adjusting drip rates, noting vitals on the electronic system with practiced efficiency. Room 712 has a post-op abdominal resection, stable. Room 714 is an elderly woman with sepsis climbing her fever curve despite the antibiotics. Room 716 empty. Room 718 holds a trauma admission from earlier in the shift, a construction worker with fractured ribs and a pneumothorax that the attending decided to manage conservatively. Watch and wait. Katie has watched and waited plenty. She knows how to read the subtle language of machines and breath and blood chemistry. She knows when to speak and when to stay silent. Her hands move through the motions with muscle memory so ingrained it requires almost no conscious thought. Change the dressing on the central line with perfect sterile technique, the snap of nitrile gloves sounds like tiny gunshots in the quiet. Flush the arterial line with normal saline. Check the medication drip, morphine and propofol running at precise rates. The concentration required for this work is exactly what Katie needs, something demanding enough to keep her mind anchored in the present, something that doesn't leave room for memory or regret. The hospital is filled with dying people. Everyone here understands that. Nobody asks why you volunteered for the night shift. Nobody asks why you park in the back lot and arrive 15 minutes early to sit in your car in the dark before you clock in. At 12:30 a.m., Dr. Marcus Hargrove arrives for late rounds. He is the type of man who moves through spaces as though he owns them, not because he actually purchased the building but because he cannot imagine a world where his presence doesn't command immediate deference. His tie is still perfectly knotted at 1 in the morning. His shoes are leather and expensive and shine like they're someone's job to maintain. He carries a tablet under his arm and moves from room to room with the attention span of a man reviewing inventory at a store he doesn't particularly care about. His attending physician, Dr. Chen, follows 3 steps behind him. So does the intern. So does Katie, because that is her job, night shift nurse, documentation specialist, the person who knows the actual condition of every patient because she has been watching them while the day shift wrote their notes and left. It happens in room 718, the trauma case. Hargrove pulls up the billing codes on his tablet and Katie glances at the screen as she's adjusting the patient's oxygen mask. That second of visual contact is all it takes. Her eyes register the disconnect immediately, the codes don't match the clinical notes. A level 3 emergency department visit billed as a level 5. Extra imaging charges for x-rays that were never ordered. A surgical consultation that never happened. Her pupils dilate by maybe a millimeter. Her breathing doesn't change. She doesn't gasp or let her jaw fall open or show the kind of theatrical shock that marks an amateur. She registers it. Files it away. Looks back at the patient. But Hargrove sees it. He is the kind of intelligent that isn't interested in genuine medical practice, the kind that finds ways to maximize profit within the grey spaces of insurance billing, the kind that has already convinced himself that he is clever enough to never get caught. And he has just watched Katie Rodriguez, a night shift nurse he hired exactly 1 week ago from a resume with 1 reference and a job history full of gaps, recognize something on his tablet that she shouldn't have been able to understand unless she had medical knowledge far exceeding that of a standard RN. Unless she had spent time around people who understood billing fraud well enough to spot it instantly. Unless she had been around that kind of system before. His face doesn't change. He continues his rounds. But something has shifted in the room's atmosphere, a pressure change like the air right before a storm, and Katie feels it the way she used to feel incoming mortars, as a vibration in the base of her skull that she learned a very long time ago never to ignore. After the physicians finish their rounds and the hallway returns to its nighttime hush, Katie returns to the med station on the 7th floor. The monitors blink their steady rhythm. The ventilator in room 712 wheezed its mechanical cadence. She sits at the computer terminal and reviews the charts she's supposed to review, documenting her nursing assessments in the careful, professional language that leaves no room for interpretation or opinion. Her hands are steady on the keyboard. Not because she isn't afraid, she is, in that bone-deep way of someone who recognizes a threat, but because she learned a long time ago that trembling is a luxury. Fear is information. You process it. You stay alert. You don't let it shake you where anyone can see. She doesn't know that Dr. Hargrove has already pulled his personnel file on her. Doesn't know that he has noticed the sparse reference list, only a hospital administrator in Seattle, a discharge coordinator in San Diego, and a brief mention of time at a clinic in Walter Reed. Doesn't know that he has started making phone calls to people who owe him favors. Doesn't know that her employment history reads like someone who has deliberately buried their past, someone who has worked hard to become invisible, and in his mind, invisible is exactly the same as suspicious. The rest of her shift passes uneventfully. At 3 a.m., as she's checking on room 714, a Black Hawk helicopter passes overhead, low enough that the rotor wash rattles the windows and makes the building shudder. Katie doesn't move. Doesn't turn. Her hands continue adjusting the sepsis patient's antibiotics drip. But something in her shoulders tightens, a minute tensioning of muscles that most people wouldn't notice unless they knew exactly what to look for. A doctor who spent the morning reading her single reference, and who is already thinking about what he saw, would notice it. By the time her 7 a.m. relief arrives, Katie has changed the dressings on 3 patients, restarted 1 failing 4, documented 17 pages of nursing notes, and kept her head down through every moment of it. She walks to her locker in the basement, opens the door to the space she claimed on her first day, and looks at the boots. Desert tan. Scarred from sharp gravel. The lace is still knotted because some part of her hasn't been ready to untie them, to officially make them past tense instead of present. She reaches in and touches the leather briefly, just her fingertips, like they might burn her. Then she closes the locker and heads for the parking lot as the sun comes up over Savannah, indifferent to every secret hidden inside its hospitals. The antiseptic smell hit Katie before she even entered room 447. That particular mixture of bleach and something else, the sweetness of decay masked by industrial cleaners. She knew that smell. Knew it meant the end was close. The cancer patient's family had gathered in a semicircle around the bed, 3 generations compressed into a room designed for 1. The daughter held her father's hand. The grandson sat rigid in the corner chair, jaw clenched so tight Katie could see the muscle flexing from the doorway. This was the kind of vigil that required a certain gentleness. The kind where you moved like water, careful not to disturb the delicate surface of their grief. Katie carried the fresh dressing pack in both hands, her movements economical. She'd changed this dressing 4 times. The wound protocol was textbook: irrigation with normal saline, application of enzymatic debridement ointment, covered with a non-adherent gauze pad secured with paper tape. Exactly as the manual specified. Exactly as it should be. She was halfway through the 2nd layer when Dr. Hargrove entered. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him. White coat crisp. Stethoscope draped like a medal. He picked up the chart without knocking, without acknowledging the family, without the basic courtesy of human recognition. The grandson's jaw tightened further. Hargrove's eye scanned the chart. His expression changed. Not quickly. Deliberately. Like he was choosing the moment to become angry. "Ms. Rodriguez." His voice had a particular quality to it, the voice of a man addressing someone he'd already decided was incompetent. "This is completely unacceptable. Did you even attend nursing school, or did you get your degree from a cereal box?" The room temperature shifted. Not actually, but it felt that way. Katie's hand stilled on the gauze pad. She could feel the daughter's eyes on her. The grandson leaning forward. The old man in the bed, mercifully sedated, oblivious to this small public execution. Katie took one measured breath. Let it travel down through her chest, past her ribs, all the way to her core where something had learned to be still during far worse than this. A single tear formed in her left eye. Just one. She wiped it with the back of her gloved hand without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. When she spoke, her voice emerged quiet and steady, each word placed like a chess piece. "The dressing protocol is on page 47 of the hospital manual, Doctor. Would you like me to show you?" The family gasped silently. Not actual sound, the kind of intake of breath that happens in throats but never quite reaches air. Hargrove's face reddened from the collar up. His jaw worked without producing sound for a moment. He looked at the family, who were staring at him now with the particular judgment that only grieving people can deploy, and something flickered across his expression, not shame, never shame, but the awareness that this particular audience was not going to validate him. He turned and left without another word. But Katie understood. She'd seen the calculation in his eyes. The decision that had been made in that moment. You don't answer back to someone like Hargrove and walk away clean. You just get to choose when and how the payment comes due. 2 days later, Katie entered the break room at 11:41 p.m. with her coffee mug and the small succulent plant she kept at her locker, a pathetic little jade thing with leaves the color of weak tea, dying incrementally regardless of how much water she gave it. Perfect metaphor for her life, actually. She'd settled into the corner chair, the one by the window where she could see the parking lot and the river beyond it, when the room collectively stood. There was no announcement. No sudden agreement. The 3 nurses who'd been sitting on the sofa, Jasmine, Rodriguez, and Chen, simply stood, gathered their belongings, and left. One of them, Chen, avoided eye contact so deliberately it felt like violence. Katie didn't follow them. Didn't speak. She sat with her coffee cooling in the mug and her plant dying on the small table beside her and understood that this was how institutional assassination worked. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that happened in hallways and break rooms and in the strategic absence of people who suddenly had reasons to be elsewhere. By the next morning, other nurses had adopted the pattern. She'd sit down at the lunch table and within moments, excuse-dependent departures would follow. Forgotten meetings. Restocking that needed to happen immediately. Suddenly critical bathroom breaks. Within 3 days, the break room had developed an involuntary reflex. Katie arrived, and everyone else left. Hargrove noticed. He said nothing about it directly, but he'd pause when he saw her, watching how the room emptied, and something like satisfaction would cross his face. He was using the hospital itself as his instrument now. Not crude confrontation. The slower, more effective architecture of institutional erosion. By week 3, Katie's name appeared on the unit disciplinary board outside the nursing supervisor's office. The official notice was printed on white paper with a hospital seal at the top and a description that bore no relation to any moment in her actual life: insubordination. Failure to follow physician orders. Unprofessional conduct toward attending physician. There were blank spaces for her to sign acknowledging the charges. As if acknowledgement equaled guilt. She stood reading it for 47 seconds. A passing orderly slowed, pretending to adjust something on the bulletin board below it. She could feel his curiosity like heat. The famous nurse nobody, finally getting what she deserved. The story would be retold 3 times before shift change. That night, in the ICU medication room where the cameras had a blind spot near the back corner, Katie had studied the angles on her second week and noted where the lenses couldn't reach. Hargrove cornered her while she was pulling medications for her patients. "You're a ghost trying to play nurse, nobody." His voice was low, conversational, the kind of tone a predator uses when they're confident about the kill. "I've been reviewing your file. Barely any employment history. Gaps everywhere. Military record redacted. What are you running from? Negligence? Addiction? Assault charges?" Katie's hands went perfectly still on the medication tray. Ampicillin. Metoprolol. Pantoprazole. Each vial waiting to be distributed to people fighting for their lives in the rooms beyond this small sterile space. "I've seen what real failure looks like, doctor." Her voice came out quiet and controlled, the kind of control that gets built on foundations of things unspeakable. "And this isn't my shame to carry." Hargrove's jaw tightened visibly. He'd expected anger. Defensiveness. The emotional reaction of a nurse who'd finally been cornered. Instead, he got something that looked like pity delivered in a whisper. His hands clenched and unclenched. "Keep it up." His words came clipped now, anger finally showing at the edges. "There are processes I can initiate. Psychological evaluation. Mandatory reporting to the state board. One more incident and you're done. Not reassigned. Done." He left her there with the medication tray and the knowledge that the institutional machinery was now in motion. He'd moved beyond public humiliation into the realm of documented sabotage. Every word he'd spoken in front of the family in room 447 had been overheard by a unit secretary. The disciplinary board notice was official documentation. His calls to her references, his flagging of her file, his psychological fitness implications, all of it was being layered into a structure that would hold together under scrutiny. This was how professionals destroyed people. Not in dramatic confrontations but in the accumulation of small institutional facts that eventually became undeniable. Katie returned to the medication room corner, the one outside the camera's reach, and for exactly 12 seconds she allowed her hands to shake. Not from fear. From the particular tremor that comes from restraint, from holding something back so hard that the holding becomes its own kind of violence. She looked at her hands like they belonged to someone else. These hands had held lives together. In field hospitals where the walls were canvas. In desert heat where the screams never quite stopped echoing. And now they were shaking from being called nurse nobody in a medication room in Savannah. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next would change everything, though Katie had no idea it was already in motion. In that same moment, 2 floors above her medication room corner, Corporal Danny Reeves was being wheeled through the emergency entrance on a stretcher from Walter Reed, his IED wounds fresh enough to still bleed through the bandaging, his vital signs already beginning their downward slide. He had no idea he was about to code. Dr. Hargrove had no idea he was about to witness something he couldn't explain and couldn't control. And Marcus, the combat medic on the overnight shift, the one who'd spent 3 years in Kandahar at a forward surgical team, had no idea he was about to recognize someone he'd thought was dead. The emergency entrance doors opened. The ambulance crew called out vitals. The clock was already running. The ambulance crew called out vitals. The clock was already running. Danny Reeves arrived at Sacred Heart's Trauma Bay at 11:08 p.m. on a Tuesday, bleeding from 17 separate laceration points where IED shrapnel had found flesh instead of ceramic plate. 23 years old. Corporal, 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, still wearing the muscle memory of Helm and Province under his skin like a second set of nerves. The paramedics had already pushed 2 liters of normal saline through a 16-gauge peripheral line, but his systolic was drifting downward, 130, 128, 124, and that downward trend was a conversation with his own body about how much time it had left. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the trauma bay at 11:53 p.m. with the speed of a man who smelled money in a Marine's chart. Level 2 trauma activation. Shrapnel wounds. Days of ICU care minimum. Imaging. Surgery consultations. Operating room time. The kind of case that kept a bed occupied for 72 hours at $8,400 a day, except Hargrove was already calculating how those hours could be redirected elsewhere. A 78-year-old with a stable MI in the step-down unit. Insurance approval, guaranteed. Recovery timeline, shorter. Profit margin per bed hour, significantly higher. He examined Reeves's wounds with the clinical precision of a man who had never fired a weapon in his life, then stepped back and checked his watch like he was timing something. Katie arrived at Sacred Heart for the 11 p.m. shift at 10:11 p.m., 17 minutes early as always, with her faded scrubs and her invisible presence and the worn combat boots laced to the exact tension that kept blood from pooling in her lower extremities during a 14-hour shift. She was pulling her hair back into a regulation bun when the overhead speaker crackled with the code. Trauma activation, Trauma Bay, Level 2. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, changing into fresh scrubs, grabbing the trauma pack, heading toward the controlled chaos of an arrival, but something in her chest tightened. The radio traffic during transport had mentioned 3/5 Marines. She'd heard that unit designation called out in the context of patrol routes and casualty evacuation protocols more times than she could count. The bay was choreography. Each person had a position, a role, a moment when their hands would matter. The resident was drawing arterial blood. The trauma nurse was running normal saline through a Levels 1 rapid infuser, the cold fluid pushing toward Corporal Reeves's for lines like a race against a clock no one else could hear. Katie positioned herself across from the resident and began the systematic work of assessing, recording, anticipating, the mechanical work that allowed her to be present without being present, to keep her face smooth and her voice neutral and her hand steady even as something in her sternum was trying to claw its way out. Because Corporal Danny Reeves's eyes opened at exactly 12:04 a.m. and found hers, and in that moment, two people who had both survived Kandahar looked at each other and knew. 3rd Battalion, she said quietly, her hands continuing their work without hesitation. His pupils dilated when he tried to focus, but his mouth formed the word, dark horse. She didn't pause. She didn't flinch. But something inside her shifted like tectonic plates, and Katie understood with absolute clarity that this young man had seen the same sky split open, heard the same sounds that lived permanently in her nervous system, carried the same weight that made normal sleep impossible. She was inserting a second peripheral line when Hargrove's voice cut through the bay like a scalpel, assign Rodriguez to lower acuity cases. We need seasoned staff on this one. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in clinical authority, and it landed like a tactical missile because both of them knew why he was saying it. Katie met his eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough that he saw her understanding, long enough that he saw she wasn't going to argue in front of witnesses, and then she moved to the next task. By 12:16 a.m., after Reeves's wounds had been documented and his imaging ordered and his surgical consultations placed on standby, Katie had been reassigned to the med-surg floor where the patients didn't need combat medics. They needed pleasant bedside manner. They needed invisibility. They needed exactly what Hargrove assumed she was. She spent the next hours drifting through patient rooms, checking for sites, adjusting pain medications, speaking in the soft voice of a nurse who had never saved 17 lives in a single field hospital siege, who had never performed emergency procedures while artillery screamed overhead, who was exactly as ordinary as her chart suggested. At 3:08 a.m., she stood in the break room with her lukewarm coffee and made a decision that had probably been inevitable since the moment Hargrove saw her recognize his fraud. The other nurses, the ones who'd stopped sitting with her at lunch 3 weeks ago, left the room one by one without speaking. She found him at the medication station on ICU, checking orders on a tablet, his face lit by the soft glow of the screen like a man reviewing his financial portfolio. Corporal Reeves needs to stay for full surgical workup, she said. Quiet. Even. The voice of someone requesting, not demanding. Hargrove didn't look up from the screen. His vital signs are stabilizing. Complications appear to be minimal. Weekend discharge is reasonable given current trajectory. His left anterior thoracic wound extends toward the mediastinum. The CT showed possible pericardial involvement. He needs Your concern is noted, Rodriguez. The way he said her name was like spitting something distasteful. However, the attending physician makes discharge recommendations. Not the nursing staff. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the corridor, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, keeping someone alive who wanted to be awake. Katie could feel her heart rate elevated, could feel the familiar pressure in her temples that meant her body was recognizing this as a threat, a negotiation with death, a moment where the wrong choice meant losing. The same mathematics she'd learned in a tent in Kandahar under fire. The same calculus that had kept 19 people breathing when 7 had already stopped. You're discharging him to free up the bed for the MI patient in step down, she said. Not a question. A statement of fact, precise as a surgical strike. That patient has stable cardiac function. This Marine has shrapnel embedded near the pericardium. If that develops into tamponade and he's at home. Are you suggesting I'm putting profit ahead of patient care? Hargrove's voice remained clinical, but his jaw had tightened. He still didn't look up from the tablet. That's a serious accusation, Rodriguez. One that could constitute insubordination. I'm suggesting you're making a dangerous decision. He turned the tablet off, set it down with deliberate precision, and finally looked at her. His eyes were the color of winter clouds, and they held the look of a man who had been forced to acknowledge something he'd hoped to ignore. I'll be documenting this conversation. Your name will appear in Corporal Reeves's chart as the staff member who challenged the discharge plan without clinical justification. Is that clear? It's clear. Good. You're reassigned to MedSurg through the end of the month. Effective immediately. She turned to leave. The boots made no sound on the tile floor, muscle memory of movement through hostile spaces, of being present without announcing presence. But she paused at the corridor entrance and said something that made Hargrove's breath catch audibly. I've seen what real failure looks like, Doctor. I've held people while it happened. This isn't my shame to carry. By 4:23 a.m., Katie was sitting with a post-operative hernia repair patient, explaining pain management protocols to someone who'd never fought in a war, never held a tourniquet around their own leg to stop the bleeding, never understood what it meant to save someone by refusing to let them die. The patient was sleeping. The machines were doing their work. And Katie was thinking about Corporal Reeves in the ICU, about a young man whose body was still processing trauma that no CT scan would ever show, about a system that measured value in bed hours and insurance approval codes instead of in lives. At 5:53 a.m., Marcus the combat medic, the older one who'd worked the bay during Reeves's arrival, found her at the medication station. He didn't say anything. He just held her eyes for a moment, and in that moment, Katie understood he knew. Not everything. Not her rank or her history or what service looked like when you'd already given everything you had. But he knew she was something other than what her badge said. He knew her hands had held someone's arterial bleeding and kept it from becoming a funeral. He pulled out his phone, stepped into the stairwell, and dialed a number that Katie couldn't hear but could absolutely feel, the kind of call that changes trajectories, that pulls the right people into the right place at exactly the right time. She didn't know what he was saying. She didn't know who was listening on the other end of that line or what networks were being activated or what machinery was beginning to turn in response. She only knew that she'd defended Corporal Reeves with everything she had, that she'd refused to let profit decide whether he lived or died, that she'd crossed a line that Hargrove had deliberately drawn and dared her to step over. The hospital was quiet around her. The night shift was winding down. The machines kept their rhythms. And somewhere in the ICU, a Marine was sleeping without knowing that a senior chief petty officer had just blown up her own career to protect him from premature discharge. The real nightmare was still 3 hours away. She just didn't know it yet. The dressing change was routine. Standard protocol for post-operative wound assessment. Corporal Marcus Reeves, 23 years old, 2 weeks post-IED injury from Kandahar, same place Katie had walked through screaming, same dust that had buried her friends. He was stable when she arrived at 4:33 a.m. His vitals were textbook. Oxygen at 96%. Heart rate steady at 84. She was checking the pericardial drain when his monitor went wild. 1 second of normalcy. 1 second of silence. Then the flatline started. His eyes rolled back. Lips turned grey. The monitor screamed. Katie moved before her brain caught up with her hands, muscle memory from a field hospital in Kandahar where the shelling didn't care about protocol, where she'd learned to work in controlled panic the way other people learn to breathe. She called for help but didn't wait. She grabbed the crash cart. Her voice dropped to the precision of a surgeon, 14-gauge needle. Midclavicular line, second intercostal space. Move. The resident froze. Katie was already moving his gown aside, already finding the landmarks her hands remembered. Her fingers steady as surgical steel. No tremor. No hesitation. Just the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this before while bombs fell. The needle went in. 2 centimeters. 3. She felt the give of tissue, the give of the pericardium, and then the hiss of air escaping. Pressurized blood released like a valve opening. The monitor's rhythm changed. Not normal yet but alive. Alive. O2 sat climbed. 92. 95. 98. Stable. His color returned like someone flipping a switch. His eyes fluttered. He was back. Silence fell over the ICU like a prayer answered. The resident who'd frozen during the procedure stood staring at her hands. The combat medic assisting, Marcus, call sign Gator, a former Marine Corps field medic now working security, stepped closer. He was examining her movements like a man watching a ghost. "I know that technique," he said quietly. His voice had changed. Respectful. Wary. Field decompression under fire. "You were Navy, weren't you?" "You were." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. Recognition. Understanding. The realization that the quiet night shift nurse they'd all dismissed had just performed a procedure that most physicians only read about in textbooks. Katie didn't answer. She was already checking the pressure readings, adjusting the drainage, documenting vitals in the chart with her pen moving faster than her heartbeat. The attending was wheeling in. Dr. Sarah Chen, who actually knew medicine, who would see exactly what had happened and understand the implications. Katie looked directly at her, cardiac tamponade. Occult accumulation. He was compensating until the pericardial pressure exceeded his cardiac output. 2 more minutes and he was dead. Dr. Chen's face went pale as she processed the words and realized Katie had just said them with the authority of someone who'd done this in combat. "Did you?" Chen started. "Had to," Katie said flatly. He would have coded. It wasn't the procedure that destroyed everything. It was the calm. It was the knowledge. It was the moment when Katie Rodriguez, night shift nurse, broke character for 60 seconds and let everyone see what she'd been hiding. Corporal Reeves was going to live because she had spent 14 consecutive hours alone in a surgical suite in Kandahar while her commanding officer bled out in the room next to her. That kind of knowledge doesn't hide. Eventually it shows. Dr. Hargrove found out within an hour. Not from the gossip chain. Not from the nursing staff who were already whispering about what they'd witnessed. But from the attending's notes, documentation that Katie had performed an emergency pericardiocentesis, which meant someone in administration had called him, which meant he understood that she'd just proven she wasn't just a nurse. She was something else entirely. Something his network of favors and leverage couldn't touch if the truth came out. So he moved fast. The phone call started at 5:13 a.m. Katie heard about them later, hospital staff who answered when Hargrove's personal line lit up. "First call to board member Dr. William Chen, we may have a staffing issue." "Yes, the Rodriguez woman. I'm concerned about her judgment on the Reeves case." "No, nothing documented yet, but I'm asking you to trust my assessment. We should accelerate the timeline." Chen owed Hargrove $6,000 from a failed investment partnership. Chen said yes. Second call to the hospital administrator, Bill Warren, I need authorization to move forward with a termination. Yes, her. Performance issues that have been building. I'm bringing in an outside investigator. Yes, today. No, this is above your pay grade, Bill, I'm handling it personally. Hargrove had helped Warren's daughter into a residency 5 years ago. Warren said, however you need to handle it, doctor. Third call to an outside investigator from an agency Katie had never heard of, I need a rapid psychological evaluation. PTSD concerns. Prior military service she failed to disclose. No, I don't have documentation. I need you to create a paper trail. The investigator said, we can have preliminary findings by end of shift. By 6:15 a.m., Hargrove was contacting Katie's references. The former nurse manager at her previous job in Charleston got a call, I'm investigating Katie Rodriguez. Can you speak to her psychological stability? Any incidents where she seemed unstable? Any concerns about PTSD? The manager, who'd given Katie a glowing reference, suddenly understood the call was framed as a trap. Hargrove wasn't asking about competence. He was asking about weakness. The manager paused, choosing her words carefully, and Hargrove interpreted the hesitation as confirmation of everything he was implying. By 7:16 a.m., when Katie's shift was supposed to end, she was summoned to the Human Resources office on the second floor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were screaming. She knew before she walked in. The way the HR director looked at her, not angry, but sad, which was somehow worse. The envelope on the desk was cream-colored, expensive stock. Inside was a termination letter citing failure to disclose prior employment history and concerns about psychological fitness related to undisclosed prior military service. PTSD. That's what they'd weaponized against her. The same thing she'd run from, the same reason she'd buried her uniform at the bottom of a closet, the same thing she'd tried to heal alone in the dark of the night shift. Hargrove had taken her survival mechanism and turned it into a liability. Katie signed the papers without reading them. She didn't argue. Didn't explain. Didn't defend herself. The mask didn't crack. Her voice remained level, her hand steady. I'll clean out my locker, she said. By 9:15 a.m., she was standing in the rain at a bus stop 6 blocks from Sacred Heart, holding everything she owned from that job in a cardboard box. A cracked mug with "World's Okayest Nurse" printed on it, a joke gift from her first week. A dying succulent she'd kept watering even though it clearly wanted to die. A photo of her unit from Kandahar, 11 faces, 6 of them gone now. Sarah with her laugh that could light up the darkest room. Thompson with his terrible jokes. Martinez with his dog-eared letters from home that never made it there. And the combat boots. The one she'd bought on the runway at Bagram with cash she'd saved from hazard pay. 2,200 kilometers walked in those boots. Through sand dunes that shifted under her feet like time itself. Through moments where staying alive was a choice she made every 4 minutes. The rain came down hard, mixing with tears she finally let fall because there was nobody watching. No one to report her weakness. No one to use it against her. Just a woman with a cardboard box and a pair of boots that had seen things no one should see, standing in Savannah, Georgia, 3 hours after she'd saved a Marine's life and 3 hours before her entire existence would change forever. She didn't know yet. She was just crying in the rain, letting it all leak out, the Kandahar screams, the dead faces, the careful invisibility she'd maintained for years, the fact that she'd finally been good at something only to watch it be used to destroy her. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Her uniform was still damp. She smelled like antiseptic and sweat and the iron-copper scent of blood that never fully washed away no matter how many showers she took. The boots dripped water onto the concrete. The box was getting soggy. The mug would probably break soon anyway. That was when Miguel found her. Her 17-year-old son, her living proof that there had been a before Kandahar and a life worth protecting, standing on the sidewalk in his high school hoodie with something in his hands that made Katie's breath stop. A shadow box. The one she'd hidden in the garage behind paint cans and old Christmas decorations. The one she'd never opened herself because opening it would mean admitting what was inside. Miguel's face was furious and determined in equal measure. Miguel didn't knock. He walked past the security desk where two officers who recognized him from his mother's night shift simply nodded, let him through without stopping him, without asking questions. The rain had soaked his jacket, plastered his dark hair to his forehead. In his hands, the shadow box, 6 inches by 8, wooden frame, glass front, the kind that belonged on a wall in a veteran study, not being carried by a 17-year-old down a hospital corridor at 11:48 p.m. His jaw was set the way Katie's got when she made a decision that terrified her. The administrative conference room was on the 3rd floor. Board meeting. Hargrove had called it emergency session 3 hours after Katie took that termination letter with her name printed in a font that made it look official, made it look permanent. Miguel had been waiting in the hospital parking garage when his mother emerged, and he'd seen the cardboard box, the way her hand shook just slightly as she set it in the trunk. He'd seen her stand there for 6 seconds before driving home, and that was when he made his own decision. He'd gone to the garage. Moved the Christmas decorations. Found the shadow box behind the paint cans where she'd hidden it for 2 years. The conference room doors were oak, heavy, impressive in the way corporate spaces are designed to be. Miguel pushed through both of them at once. There were 8 people in the room. Administrator Warren at the head of the table. 3 board members Miguel didn't recognize. Dr. Hargrove standing near the window with his arms crossed, mid-sentence. And 2 others, a woman in a dark suit taking notes, and a man in captain's dress blues with ribbons that caught the light. The man's face was familiar. Corporal Reeves's commanding officer. The conversation stopped. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez," Miguel said. His voice didn't shake. He'd practiced in the car. "And you fired the wrong person." He opened the shadow box. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that happens in hospitals sometimes, when a patient flatlines and everyone freezes for exactly 1 second before reaction kicks in. But this silence lasted longer. This silence had weight. The medals caught the fluorescent overhead light. The Navy Cross first, blue ribbon, gold anchor, the decoration that means you did something extraordinary under fire. Below it, 2 purple hearts, the maroon ribbons with gold centers. Bronze star with the Vela device, the V that means combat heroism. The medals were arranged like a prayer, like evidence, like a confession Katie had never wanted to make. Administrator Warren stood slowly. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the shadow box, and Miguel let her take it. She pulled a file folder from the stack beside her, Katie's personnel record, and turned to a page that had been flagged, had clearly been sitting there unread until this exact moment. "Redacted service record," Warren read aloud, her voice dropping. She turned to another page. The medical training certification. The commendation letter. Then her eyes went to the woman in the suit. "When did you call the fraud hotline?" The woman was FBI. It was obvious now. Her posture, the way she held her pen, the way her eyes had shifted when Miguel opened that box like she was checking something off a mental list. "Approximately 1 hour ago," the woman said. She closed her notebook. "But we've been investigating Dr. Hargrove's billing practices for the past 6 weeks based on submitted evidence." The captain in dress blue stepped forward. His name tape read Morrison. His eyes went to Miguel, then to the empty chair where Katie should have been sitting, then to Dr. Hargrove. "I'm Captain James Morrison, Commanding Officer, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Battalion," he said, and his voice had the particular precision of someone trained to deliver information that changes trajectories. "Senior Chief Rodriguez saved 19 lives during the Kandahar field hospital siege in 2015. She performed combat medicine under fire for 14 consecutive hours. She received a personal commendation from the Secretary of Defense. Her psychiatric evaluation upon separation was rated fully adjusted." He paused. His next words were measured. "She didn't leave active duty because she was unstable. She left because she had earned the right to choose her own next chapter." The door opened. Another man entered, younger, wearing the ID badge of Sacred Heart's IT department. Frank Chen. He held a laptop and set it on the conference table without asking permission. 6 months of security footage, Frank said. His voice was quiet, but it had a thickness to it, the kind of weight that comes from having seen something you can't unsee. Every night shift. Every alteration. He opened the laptop and turned the screen toward the room. There was Dr. Hargrove at 2:17 a.m., 3 weeks ago, in the medication room. Hands moving across a keyboard. Charts appearing, being modified, the procedure code shifting from accurate to inflated. Next frame, 2:43 a.m., billing office. Same hands. Different fraudulent entries. Insurance code changes that added approximately $847,000 to claims over the past 8 months. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, Frank said. His eyes never left Hargrove's face. When Dr. Hargrove asked me to delete these footage files, I made a choice. I don't destroy evidence. Not for anyone. The woman in the suit made a phone call. Stepped into the hallway. 2 minutes later, she returned with another man, a Georgia Medical Board representative, ID credential clipped to his jacket. He reviewed the footage silently. His expression didn't change. When he finished, he turned to Warren. Medical license suspension, pending full investigation, he said. I'm recommending the state board revoke his privileges entirely. This is systematic fraud. Dr. Hargrove tried to speak. His mouth opened. Nothing came out for 3 seconds, which in a room this quiet felt like an eternity. His face had gone the color of old wallpaper. This is a misunderstanding. She's unstable. The woman clearly has PTSD, she's hallucinating this. Captain Morrison's voice cut through like a blade through tissue. Senior Chief Rodriguez held a surgical instrument steady while mortar rounds were collapsing the ceiling above her position. I've read her service file. I've seen her evaluation results. And I watched her refuse pain medication so she could continue treating casualties while she was bleeding from a shrapnel wound herself. He took 1 step forward. You didn't fire her because she's unstable. You fired her because she was the only person in this hospital who recognized what you were doing, and you knew she had the integrity not to look away. Corporal Reeves appeared in the doorway. He looked thin still, but his eyes were clear. He looked at Miguel first, nodded slightly, then turned to the FBI agent. Dr. Hargrove told me I needed to be discharged, Reeves said. His voice was steady. Said there was nothing left they could do for me. But Senior Chief Rodriguez knew that wasn't true. She performed an emergency pericardiocentesis, needle decompression for the tamponade, while everyone else was walking me toward the door. She saved my life twice. Once from the IED, once from his negligence. He paused. And now he's lying about her mental health to cover what he did. Hargrove's phone began vibrating on the table. He ignored it. It buzzed again. Again. The board members he'd called in favors from, Miguel realized. The ones who'd agreed to justify the termination, who texted back within minutes saying they'd support his version. Now they were calling back, withdrawing. Canceling. He watched Hargrove's face as each vibration meant another piece of his network deciding he wasn't worth the risk. Administrator Warren's hands were shaking now as she set down the personnel file. This hospital will be conducting an immediate internal audit of every patient under your care in the past 12 months, she said to Hargrove. Her voice had an edge that hadn't been there before. Legal is being notified. You are to have no patient contact effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. The FBI agent was already making calls, federal fraud charges, Medicare billing investigation, potentially bringing in NCIS given the military angle. The board member who'd seemed most sympathetic to Hargrove stood abruptly, face flushed. We need to suspend him pending investigation, she said, her voice tight. And we need to contact every hospital where he's worked. There may be other victims. Miguel stood very still, holding the shadow box that wasn't his to hold anymore. His mother's medals were being photographed by the FBI agent, documented, entered into evidence. The room had transformed from a meeting designed to destroy Katie Rodriguez into an emergency session to contain the damage of the man who'd tried to destroy her. What nobody in that room knew yet, what the media wouldn't report until morning, was that Katie's story was already spreading. A Navy SEAL captain publicly defending a female combat veteran. A hospital IT director who'd blown the whistle on fraud. A teenage boy who'd walked into a corporate meeting holding proof that authority figures could be wrong. The Pentagon was already being notified. The White House would be calling by morning, interested in her service record, interested in how a decorated military nurse had been weaponized against rather than honored for her sacrifice. 3 hours. The exact same span of time between when Katie had saved Corporal Reeves's life and when she'd been handed a termination letter. 3 hours from exposure to collapse. Dr. Hargrove's hands trembled as security arrived at the door. His carefully constructed reputation, his network of allies, his position, all of it crumbling like old drywall under the weight of what he actually was. Katie would learn about this later when Miguel brought her to Sacred Heart the next morning and Administrator Warren offered her the Director of Emergency Medicine position with tears in her eyes. Katie would hear about the security footage, the FBI investigation, the medical board suspension. She would listen without expression while board members apologized, while Hargrove's allies suddenly had no knowledge of any agreement they'd made. And when Warren asked what Katie needed to accept the position, Katie thought of the nurses who'd isolated her, the colleagues who'd abandoned her, the system that had let a predator operate unchecked. Veteran Hiring Initiative, Katie said quietly. Mental health support for staff. And protection for whistleblowers. Anyone who sees something that wrong, they shouldn't have to choose between their career and doing the right thing. Warren nodded before Katie even finished speaking. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez stood in the Rose Garden under spring sunlight that felt like absolution, receiving a Presidential Citizen's Medal while Miguel stood beside her in his Marine dress uniform he'd enlisted, following her legacy as surely as morning follows night. The citation read her full record. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Navy Cross recipient. Angel of Kandahar. Healthcare advocate. The president placed the medal around her neck and said something about quiet heroes changing the world, and Katie felt the weight of it, not burden, but purpose finally acknowledged. Dr. Hargrove sold supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall in North Savannah. His network vanished, his license permanently revoked, his reputation destroyed by the exact fraud he'd tried to hide behind accusations of her instability. He saw her name sometimes in the news, saw the interviews about her healthcare reforms, saw the hospital implementing her protocols. And there was nothing he could do about it except fold his insurance brochures and watch customers walk past without stopping. Katie's office on the 4th floor of Sacred Heart displayed those worn combat boots on the shelf, not hidden anymore, visible to everyone who entered. Beside them, the shadow box Miguel had carried, and a photograph of her Kandahar unit, half of them dead now, all of them heroes. When the next veteran arrived broken and silent, seeking anonymity, Katie recognized the look in their eyes. She'd been there. And she knew the way back. On her first day as director, she gathered the nursing staff and said simply, her voice carrying the weight of command, I ran from my past because I thought healing meant forgetting. I was wrong. Healing means integrating who you were with who you're becoming. The nurses who'd abandoned her in the break room now sought her mentorship. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in Katie's position? And if you want to hear more stories about the quiet heroes walking among us, like this video and hit that notification bell.